Oh, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. John Hattie on Maximizing Impact, the Power of Implementation. Just to let you know, because of the number of people we have at our event today, John will answer any questions you have probably by the end of the week or so. We'll track all your questions in the chat function of Zoom. So if you have a question for John, write it out in the chat function. We'll save those questions and we'll answer them in the near future for everyone. Next slide, please. Upcoming webinars, February 25th. Jeff Zweers on communication effect. How to enhance learning by building ideas and bridging information gaps. March 9th, Paul Emmerich France on reclaiming personalized learning. And March 23rd, Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry on where equity fits into PLC Plus. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Amanda Boudria, Executive Marketing Manager, Global Visible Learning for Corwin, to introduce today's presenter.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thanks for everyone that's on the call. I see people all the way from Australia to Waikiki, Hawaii, so welcome everyone. I'm really excited today to introduce our speaker, Professor John Hattie, and although he doesn't really need an introduction because he's pretty well known at this point. So Professor John Hattie is an award-winning education researcher, keynoter, and best-selling author who has decades of experience examining what works best in classrooms to accelerate student learning and achievement. The Visible Learning body of research is the synthesis of more than 1,600 meta-analyses comprising over 95,000 studies involving over 300 million students around the world. And from this research, Professor Hattie identified over 270 influences that have an effect on student achievement. While this is already a lot of data, John continues to collect studies to increase the confidence of his findings and strengthen the visible learning story. The visible learning research is used all across the world and was even referred to as teaching's holy grail by the Times Education Supplement. With that, I'll hand it over to Professor Hattie to talk to us a little bit about the power of implementation.
Thank you, Amanda, and it is good to be with you. For me this morning, for you the afternoon, wherever you are around the world. I am back here in Australia, in Melbourne at the moment, even though I had a wonderful week in Hawaii last week for those of you in that part of the world. And as you said, Amanda, the focus today is on this notion of impact. As I like to do, I like to start a little bit back before I come to the impact, just setting the scene. And I know some of you may have heard some of this message before, but I still think it's pretty critical that the scene's set. And the scene here, as you can see, is to try and ask the question, what is up that right-hand end of that scale? What is it that really does enhance the impact that we have on students? And I know today we're going to get down and deep about what we mean by impact. The data, yes, it's been continually updated. I've now passed the 1,600 meta-analyses, twice the number that compared to what happened in the 2009 book where I had 800 meta-analyses. A third of a billion students, and it continues to grow because the research continues to grow. The effect sizes, and just to put it in context here, we go out there and we ask a question such as, how does a particular lesson planning system work? How does timetables, if we're going to change the timetable in the school, we're going to introduce a new program into the school. And we compare either before the program is introduced, we compare after, or we compare schools which are introducing the new lesson planning method and schools that don't. And from that, we can calculate the effect size, which gives a sense of the magnitude of the effect. How big is the effect? And you can see there that almost all, about 90-something% of effect sizes we have in education are positive, greater than 0. And that sort of leads to the argument that almost everything we do has a positive impact on students. So in one sense, this seminar is easy. Probably every single one of you listening here today is having a positive impact on students. But the concern is that's not enough. As you can see, if you look at the average, which happens to be 0.4, there are an incredible number of teachers and schools that are having an incredible impact on the learning lives of kids. It's greater than 0.4. And when I look at the comparison figures for what that 0.4 means, it does mean, on average, that if you're above 0.4 in your impact, your students are gaining more than a year's impact for a year's learning. And I think that's pretty impressive. Now, of course, like every average, there's a flaw in the average. There's massive variability. Some days we're going to have higher impact than others. Some days less, and that's what we need to understand. And of course, we're going to ask the question, what do we mean by that notion of impact? So the question I want to ask each one of you listening in today is, where are you in terms of what your typical or average impact is? In the blue zone, in the yellow zone, and as you can see, there's probably hardly any, if any of you, in the red zone. And I say hardly any because a lot of those effects in the red zone make perfect sense, like the effect size of bullying on achievements minus 0.3. And quite a few of those negatives are in that kind of expected zone. So most teachers, if not all teachers, have a positive impact. The question is, to what magnitude is that sense of positive? Underlying this particular graph, incredible number of influences. And what we've been doing now on that site, which is a free site, which you can look at on your mobile phone or on your website, it lists all the up-to-date meta-analyses from the student, the home, the school, classroom, the teacher, the curricula, and we are in a process of doing once or twice a year regular updates. So as new meta-analyses are added, you can go and see what that latest research is at your fingertips. You can get a glossary of all the different terms, what we mean, and a little bit more background. As I said, we're trying continually to update this and make it more accessible, but that's not the message of today. Of course, it matters dramatically what those influences are. There's the big story. These are the big 7. When you take those third of a billion kids, when you take all those influences, these are the big messages. And you can see it begs that question, what do we mean by impact? When teachers work together, when teachers and students work together to evaluate their impact, that impact is a function of how we set our expectations. And obviously what we mean when we talk about explicit success criteria and how we can make those explicit to students so they have an understanding of what we mean by impact. It shouldn't be a guessing game. And it shouldn't be impact in my school means we just do things. We just get through the activities. But the dilemma is, there is this Goldilocks principle of challenge. We want to make it not too hard, not too easy, and certainly not too boring. Kids, like us as adults, will invest incredibly in tasks, very challenging tasks, if we are engaged and find it interesting, hence the not boring notion. The dilemma is that for some students, their sense of challenge is more or less than others, and we'll come back to that as we talk more about impact this morning. And you do not go to school to learn that which you already know. It's what we don't know. So how do we make errors seen as opportunities of learning? How do we make mistakes as welcomed as opportunities? And many kids, unfortunately, by the age of 8, learn that if they make a mistake, they've got it wrong, and it's some kind of a bad thing. It's some kind of a function of them as a person. It's just the opposite. If you go to your doctor with an illness, they don't say you're a bad person. They say, hey, we need to fix this. Same in a classroom. It's what we don't know that we have to privilege. And then we can get into a lot of discussion. Certainly I've been doing, looking at feedback and how we can maximize that back to teachers about their impact. And this is really critical because a lot of feedback that's not about the teacher's impact doesn't have very high effect sizes. And then, as I want to talk about this morning when we talk about impact, this focus on learning. So right throughout this theme, what do we mean by impact? When teachers see learning through the eyes of students, I want to encourage you in your schools to talk less about teaching. Not that it's not important, of course it is. But what is the impact of that teaching, particularly as seen through the eyes of students? And if I was coming into your school, I would be asking you, what do you mean by learning? I'd be asking the students in your class, what does it mean to be a good learner in this class? And I would hope there'd be a lot of correspondence between those two thoughts. And I certainly want students to see themselves and learn to become their own teachers, because that's what we mean by lifelong learning, self-regulation, metacognition, student agencies, all those words. How do we get students to see us as their own teachers? So that's the kind of the introduction to this notion of impact. Is clearly it's a very powerful notion. Clearly it is probably the key to understand before we can go on and talk about feedback and all the other kinds of matters. So let's get down to it. In a webinar that you may have attended last year, I talked more about impact as to DIIE for. And we talked then about the 4 components of DIIE: diagnosis, intervention, evaluation, implementation. Today, we're going to focus on the first part, which is impact. So here's the question. And I do need you to take a few moments to jot down some thoughts here, or just to think about this in your mind. If I said to you, what do you mean by impact? How would you know your impact? What kind of evidence could you bring to the table that demonstrates that you have an impact on students? What would you bring along? I'm going to give you a moment to just thought and jot notes, because it's going to help a lot in terms of where we go throughout this webinar. What do you mean by impact? And I know some of you are probably thinking, well, I'm happy to talk about how I teach. I'm happy for people to come along to my classroom and watch me teach. I'm happy to share my resources. And none of those are about impact.
And everyone, please feel free to write them in the chat function.
That's a great idea, Jeff. Thank you. I'll give you a few more moments, because I do encourage you to do this so that the next slides make more sense to you. Let me help you. What does it mean when you talk about having an impact on student learning? And if we had more time, and certainly we would want to do this with you as individual teachers and in your school, sort of questions that come off the impact question. What does success mean? Does it mean a quiet classroom, busy students? Nothing wrong with that, but I want more. What does challenge mean? And if the Goldilocks principle of challenge is so important, it has incredibly high effect sizes, how are we challenging our students? Because if our students don't feel challenged, appropriately challenged, they turn off this thing called schooling. They'd much rather play their video games, their sports, be with their friends, and not be in this place called school. And I talk a lot about this notion that every student deserves at least a year's progress for a year's input. And again, that begs that question: what does a year's progress look like? Are you prepared, for example, to bring along a student's work at the beginning and say 3 months later, and have a discussion with your colleagues about 3 months progress? This is what 3 months progress looks like. Now, be careful. It requires a lot of trust to do that, because sometimes, and sometimes not inappropriately, a fellow teacher would say, well, actually the work 3 months after is not as good as the work at the beginning. And that can happen. And we don't often have discussions amongst ourselves as educators demonstrating what progress looks like. But that's the key essence of this notion of impact, that we're adding value, that we're making progress, and we can see it in the students' work. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could go a step further and the students also can see it and understand that they're making the progress? But progress by itself is not enough. It may not be sufficient. Is it sufficient progress? Is it adequate progress? Is it the progress you'd expect? And when I go back and look at that graph I showed you earlier of the blue zone and the yellow zone, Those teachers in the blue zone that are getting effect sizes greater than 0.4, their students are making greater than a year's progress. And certainly what keeps me going as a researcher, as I go around the world, is it's stunning to see so many schools and so many teachers where this is the norm. It can happen. And the question that comes back to me all the time is, have we got the courage to identify those schools and those teachers and scale that up? Sometimes I worry about the courage, and often I very much worry about our debates in education, which tend to be focused at the bottom end of the scale, and how we fix the failures and the problems of our schools and not acknowledge that we have excellence, and that's what we need to esteem, value and grow. And then it comes to the question of what we consider as an example of an inspired and passionate teacher, because there's many of you there doing that. And if you do, as we've done, go out and ask adults to remember the teacher that inspired and was passionate to them, it really is fascinating what they come up with. They don't talk about, oh, he taught me social studies or she taught me music or whatever. They talk about two things. They talk about that teacher turned me on to their love of whatever it is they were teaching. And or that teacher saw something in me I didn't see in myself. That sense of raised expectations. They hardly ever talk. That teacher taught in a particular way. They used problem solving, they used inquiry based, they used didactics, you name it. And so it really is interesting as a profession, when we get together and talk about inspired and passionate teachers, what do we mean? And what made them so in your eyes? And this is all these are coming to this notion of impact. And so when you look at your notion of impact, do you actually help answer those questions? And I have a hunch that for many of you, like it certainly was for me when I started my work, I talked more about how to teach. I talked more about the resources. I talked more about the students, whether they were engaged in doing things. I didn't talk about what impact meant. I didn't talk about what student learning meant. I didn't often ask the students, what did they mean by being a good learner in this class? And certainly when you do that, and they say things like, sit up straight, be prepared and listen to the teacher, I now cringe to think, oh my goodness, none of that's about impact. That's all about compliance. Are they actually going through a progress? Are they actually learning in my class? And am I that kind of teacher that is that inspired and passionate teacher that turns students on to the love of learning, and that they realize and appreciate that I actually see something in them they don't see in themselves? This is my list. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with this. I'm not asking you to have all these. It's probably too many. And I certainly talk about the skill, will, and the thrill of teaching. On the will side, what is the disposition that I want my students to have? I want them to be curious. I want them to invest in learning. I want them to love learning. Hey, I'm a teacher. I've never left school. I've been in this business my whole life. I love this process of learning, and that's what I want to communicate. And yes, there are skills. I make no apology that achievement and raising achievement is a core aspect of what we do as well. I also want progress, no matter where the students start. I want to see that year's growth. And our society today, building and teaching students respect for themselves and respect for others. When I was a student in elementary school back in the 1950s, there was no expectation that my teachers had anything to do with that. That was my parents' job. That's changed. Teachers have taken on that responsibility and are very, very good at it. And certainly as that boundary between school and home starts to get more blurred as the internet and technology takes over, then we are being asked to be more responsible, to have an impact on students in terms of the respecting themselves and respecting others. And there's also a thrill that I want to have an impact on. I want students to believe that school is an inviting place to come and learn. It's a safe and fair place. And all the surveys that I've done on students about what they want in the classroom, the number one always comes out is fairness. It's not whether it's strict or whether it's laissez-faire. It's, is it a fair place to be? And I want them to feel to belong. Certainly we've discovered in the university sector over the years that this sense of belonging to this place called learning is pretty critical. And students learn, again, by about the age of 8. Is school a place I feel I belong and a place that I come to because I want to and enjoy the learning? And then I also want to introduce this notion of impact when I talk about going deep, knowing when to be deep, knowing when to be surface. And I want to come back to that because that's a pretty important notion, not just the deep and the surface, not the knowing how and the knowing that. It's knowing when to be deep, when to be surface. Now, when you compare this to your list, that's okay if you're different. But here's the killer, guys. Do your fellow teachers in your school have similar understandings in your district, in your nation? Because if we all have different views about what we mean by impact, no wonder the students, particularly in high school, as they move from one teacher to the other, they are allowed to choose their adventure. And they can pick and choose the parts they like. And that can be a real problem if their choices are not part of the belonging and the love of learning. And so I hope that we do have a discussion amongst your colleagues about what you mean by impact. And again, I know it can be a very difficult conversation, particularly when you disagree, particularly when you start to bring on artifacts of kids' work about what we mean by progress. When we go into classrooms and we talk to students about what they mean by progress and what they think that teacher's concept of impact is. But it's really an interesting task at some point, particularly those of you in high school, but it's true in the primary school, to shadow a student for a day and just watch the experiences they have, almost random at many times. The mixed messages. In this school, we do this. And the next class they go to, in the school, we do this, and it's a different message. And so how do you get that collective notion, that sense of collective belonging across the adults, the teachers in the school, about what we mean by impact? What's in your basket of goods? What is the message we want to communicate to students? And I ask you to look at your vision statement and your mission statements. And as I've seen, like you probably have, hundreds, if not thousands of those over the years, very often, they don't have much about impact. They're more about how we do things in the school, not about what those doing things are supposed to impact on. What do we want our impact on our learners and learners to be? And then do our learners also have a common understanding of what that means? So let's talk about this notion of impact, and let's look eachly at the skill, the will, and the thrill. And let's start with the skill. And certainly, as I said, achievement and progress are in there. But I'm a great fan of the Jenkins curve from Lee Jenkins. I'm a great fan of it because it's probably one of the things that drives me as much as anything else to make sure we continue to make a difference in this business called schooling. And you can see there that 95% of students at K and at year one want to come to school to learn. And it drops to the end of elementary school, start of high school, to 37%. At that point of time, 4 or 5 kids in any class, at best, want to be there to study the things that we're teaching them. I just pause at this moment and think, that's just not good enough. We are unbelievably good at turning off kids from that love of learning. Like my granddaughter's 4 at the moment, and she has such an aspiration to go to school. And the fact that both of her parents are teachers. She thinks school's going to be the most exciting place in the world. And then I look at this Jenkins curve and say, if I can do anything in my life as a grandfather, I want to turn that around. I don't want her to drift down to that 37%. 60-odd% of kids don't want to be there. They don't want to do the things we do. And my point is, that's probably more important than anything else that we have an impact on. The love of learning. Sometimes we have too much in the curriculum and we do little bits of it. And that's a good way of turning kids off. Sometimes we don't give the sense to the students that they're part of this journey and that they should share in an understanding of what impact means. And that's a good way to turn kids off. And so I ask you in your class today, tomorrow, to look at those students, perhaps talk with them, to find out which of those students are losing that enthusiasm for schooling and find ways to turn it around. If you can do that, I think you're going to have a dramatic impact on the learning lives of students. Asking them, what does it mean to be a learner in this class? And being prepared for some of them saying things like, a learner here is someone that sits quietly, does the work, finishes it, hands it in. And that's not a learner. Learning is messy. Learning has got ups and downs. I was a music teacher in my early days. So those of you who are in the music area will understand learning is a staccato. And it's up and down. It's all over the place. It's messy. And it's fun being messy. And so that compliance notion doesn't fit very well. And a lot of students who don't meet up to that 37% by the end of elementary school, they don't want to be participating just in compliance. We did a study in the last few years asking teachers, what do they mean by engaging? What is the story? When students are engaged in learning, what does it look like? And we went out to many hundreds, thousands of teachers, interviewed them, surveyed, asked them about what engagement was. And it was kind of sad. Too many of them thought engagement was doing. The students were doing the tasks. The students were actively involved in participating in the work, then they were engaged. And for many of us, sometimes there's not much learning and doing. And I'm sure all of us know that. We have to sit there and do a task. It can be painful, it can be arduous. We don't know what the expectations are. We don't know how much good's good enough. We think it just has to be handed in by a certain time with a certain length and make it look pretty. And some students love that. Unfortunately, it's not what learning is about. And so that engaged in doing, how do we switch it from being engaged in doing, from engaged in learning? And so we're developing this model where we're looking at the 3 disengagement activities. The students who withdraw, the students who avoid, the students who disrupt. And they take up a lot of our time. And we want to turn it into those who not only participate, but are willing to invest in that notion of learning and are willing to drive that learning, which I think is the key notion behind what many of us talk about when we talk about student agency, student voice. How do they be in the driving seat? And in the driving seat, sometimes you have to know. It's a really important skill to know when to ask for help, when to realize that the next step is something we don't know about and we need an expert to help us, the teacher, sometimes other students, sometimes other resources. And so how do we move engagement away from engaged in doing to engaged in learning? And when we look at these kind of notions, which comes out of Common Core, comes out of curricula everywhere in the world, when we talk about progression, how do we make progression? How do we go where to next? I look at ones like this, and this happens to be one of thousands and thousands of progressions out there. And these kind of graphs worry me dramatically, because it implies that more is the next step up in terms of content. Whereas many times the next best step is more depth in terms of what you're doing now. And so for many students, they don't want to move on to the next topic. They want to get into more deeper, and hence the sense of mastery and the sense of accomplishment. And there's an art about when to be deep and when to be surface and move on. And so when we ask students what they mean by progress, we hope it's not just learning more, knowing lots. We don't want our students to be Mrs. Google and Mrs. Siri. We want them to have an appropriate depth for certain things. And I'm sure if you look back in your own careers, it was that time that you had to go deep into some areas are the ones that you remember more. They're just learning lots of topics. And you go back to your days when you were in primary school or elementary school yourself. There'll be a few of those where you got done deep about a subject, you remember it. Not that you could cover things, and I invite you to think what you learned in social studies or English or maths when you were a 10-year-old. Most of us wouldn't have a clue. But every teacher of a 10-year-old believes every bit of the content they teach is critical. It's not. Sometimes it's that depth and that wallowing in that depth of subject that matters. To me, progress is much more like a GPS. Yeah, we have destinations. We want to get to Wagga Wagga or wherever we want to go. And there are lots of ways from where we start to how do we get there. There's no one right way. Yeah, maybe 80% of the kids go down the main highway to get from Melbourne to Wagga Wagga. But some will go around through Canberra, some will go around through Temora and lots of different places. We do not and should not imply that there's one way to progress. And if we're finding all the students that go from Melbourne through Canberra and Tuggeranong to get to Wagga Wagga, that should be as legitimate as any other route. And so understanding what progress looks like, it's not linear, it's not straightforward, it's not as if all the kids go down one path. And so we've got to be very careful when we look at progressions that we don't imply that there's one right way to do it. And if you go through Canberra and that's the wrong way because it's not the fastest way or the main highway, we somehow imply that you're a lesser. No, it's if you go through the Canberra route, what's the next best step to get to your destination? And so that notion, and particularly in today's age, where we've got much more technical resources to help us understand the different progressions that students make. And so how do we bump up from where they are now? How do we go deeper at the right time? How do we allow different routes and different times to get there? It was all part of this concept of impact. In our work, we look at a taxonomy, the Solo taxonomy. It's quite similar to Webb's depth of knowledge. It's quite similar to the cognitive complexity part of the Bloom's taxonomy. Going from knowing nothing to building an idea, many ideas, relating those ideas and extending them. When you're building the idea start, that's the surface level stage, or the knowing that stage, all the things that we need to know that about. The knowing how, the deep stage is relating and extending ideas. And this notion of impact sometimes means pausing and going to this relating and extending and looking at how we transfer knowledge and understanding. In the same way, when we look at achievement, too often in our debates, particularly when it comes down from on high, we get this notion that what's valued in schools is high achieving students. Well, that's not a very satisfactory answer, because some students start well below the average. They come with lower proficiency and lower achievement. And we shouldn't be denigrated in any way because those students are not necessarily above the average by the end of the year. So I like to put the two things together. Of course I want high achievement, but I also want to value progress. And obviously if you worked with the Corwin team and with our teams more, we'd teach you ways to measure that progress, particularly using effect sizes. Then I want to identify, are you starting above average, high achievement, but not gaining that year's growth for a year's input? Then in our view, you'd be cruising. You'd be a cruising class, cruising schools, cruising students. Of course, no one wants to start with students below average and not make progress, the unsatisfactory students, unsatisfactory teachers, unsatisfactory schools. But what's wrong if your students start below average, but they make more than a year's growth? These are the growth students. I think we should esteem those. And everybody wants to be in the optimal category, where kids start above average and they make greater than a year's growth. And the point I'm making here is that when you're talking about impact, high above average students are not necessarily the ones that we want to esteem and not necessarily the ones we want to have as the mark of impact, despite the discussions and debates in your country, in the US, and the UK, and Australia over the last 10 or so years. We value high achievement. Well, I don't value cruising students. I don't value cruising teachers and cruising schools. I value those. And there are many teachers in schools, low socioeconomic status, where kids start below average, who are making stunning success, incredible excellence. And this is why this notion of impact, I want to move away from high achievement to high growth. Every student should be on that half of the distribution. And that's what I mean by impact when I talk about the achievement and progress put together. Here, for example, is every school in Australia in terms of their reading. It's the same in maths and science. And you can see Australia has a unique, interesting problem. 50% of our schools are cruising. Kids starting above average, not making a year's growth. You can see we hardly have any in that undesirable zone, 10%. And we have about 45% who are in the desirable zone. Now, that's not good enough. And because we've had a debate and a whole narrative in this country that high achieving schools are good schools, it's led to this notion of our impact being in that 50% cruising zone. And it's very hard to turn that around. Now, I know this graph is not the same in many other parts of the world, but I want to come right back to you. What's your class? Where's your school? How do you know collectively across the staff in the school which zone you're in now? Because if you're in that cruising zone, wow, it may feel good. Parents may be happy, kids may be happy, but I think you're doing damage. Those kids deserve better. They need to be moved across into that growth zone. And you can see, we look at it not only at the school level, we look at every individual student. And we use the average of what you find in your particular class, which in this case is 0.62. And we look at the average in terms of achievement, which in this case is 58. And we graph the kids. And if you look at someone like Megan, you look at someone like Cameron, they started off at a very similar position in terms of their achievement, but they ended up in dramatically different places. And I want to understand people like Bella and Jacob and Stone and Kate, who started below average, but they're making stunning progress. What is it that we did that led to those students making that kind of progress? So switching the focus from going up to going across and having the debates about positive impact is quite a different story than if we only look at the achievement by itself. Hence is why we talk about developing visible learners, because we want the students to understand this concept of progress. We want the students to be involved and see impact. It's not just getting A's every time. The best students in the class are not necessarily those who get it easy, who know lots. The best students who are those who make the greatest progress. And that leads to the investment, to the belonging, to this notion of driving. And when I take that graph I showed you earlier and recast it in terms of the students, you can see same kind of notions. We want the teachers and the students to have the same kind of concepts about what they mean by impact. Let's look at David Alsobel's statement. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Start that. Great diagnosis. Understand what they bring to the classroom. Then work out what the appropriate challenging and success criteria are and close that gap. Yes, prior ability is pretty powerful in terms of what they know, which means we have to better understand those who start with our ability to start with and how we can get them to make that kind of same progress. And as I've illustrated, we can do that. What the student brings in terms of their working memory, how much they can hold in their memory at once. And we have this sad problem that kids below average have the same sometimes working memory strength as kids above average, but they have to overlearn so much more. And sometimes we give them tasks to do that requires so much for them to hold in their memory. And if they're sitting there saying, well, 9 lots of 6 are 54, and another child is memorize that, so they automatically know that 9 6s are 54, they can go on and use that in a problem, while that other student is still trying to work out what 9 lots of 6s are. And so how do we develop overlearning at the right time about the right stuff, which is what good learning is about? How do we leverage their prior knowledge? So they've got reduced working memory and they can attach things to previously thought ideas and previously worked out ideas. It's really critical if we're going to develop the skills related to the impact. How do we chunk? Like I said to most of you now, say out loud what your telephone number is. Go on, say it out loud. What is your telephone number? I bet most of you didn't read out the 9 or 10 numbers in your phone number. You chunked it. You went 463, 512, 916, whatever it is. And so, in fact, in a sense, you remembered 3 things, 3 chunks. And there's a whole lot of chunking that we can do to help us in terms of our understanding. And this is the kind of thing we have to worry about if we're going to worry about how students go about successfully learning, how we can actually go about coming up with teaching plans that allow them to focus on some of those learning tasks. And there's a whole debate about cognitive load, how much we can hold in our sensory memory, our working memory, and our long-term memory. In many senses, sometimes in that working memory, we have to overlearn. So it goes into long-term memory, so it's there. Whereas some of our students who start below average, they don't have as good working memory. So they can switch from what comes in to what goes into long-term memory. And I think one of the most fascinating things about memory is not so much how we remember, but how we forget. And we're all very good at that. And there's a skill in forgetting because our brains can't hold everything. How we hold relations, how we hold patterns, and that whole notion of learning. And then this notion of expectations. What expectations do you have? And this is why when we started this webinar, I talked about what do you mean by impact? If you say things like, well, these students, they come from poor homes, they come from refugee backgrounds, they come from et cetera, and you have very low expectations for them, I can guarantee you will be enormously successful. If, however, you have high expectations for all your students, I also will guarantee you will be incredibly successful. Nobody rises to low expectations. In fact, my colleague, Christine Ruby Davies, has spent a lot of her research time looking at how teachers have expectations about students. And what she finds is that if teachers have low expectations, they tend to have it for all the students. And if they have high expectations, they have it for all the students. So I ask you, what is your expectations? Yeah, the effective teacher expectations, 0.43, it's in there. But look at the effect size of student expectations. What are the expectations that students have, which they often learn from us? Incredibly powerful. And so I'm asking you to ask your students about what their expectations are and raise them and then realize them. Because if you go into classrooms of low and high expectation teachers, and you can see here the effect size of low expectations is pretty tiny, effect size of high expectations enormous. Massive differences. And what happens in that classrooms? In the views and minds of the teachers. And if you think the students don't know that, I think we're killing ourselves. And the one that most fascinates me about that is the notion of differentiation. Low expectation teachers think differentiation is giving kids different activities depending on their abilities. And unfortunately, that often interprets into, here's stuff you could do yesterday. And kids know they're getting lesser stuff from the other kids. The high expectation teachers, their concept of differentiation is more like the GPS. We aim for the same thing for all the students, but there may be different ways and different times to get there. And if you read the work by Carol Ann Tomlinson and others, that's what they mean by differentiation. It doesn't mean different activities for different kids. And so that notion of expectations and low expectations is often reinforced by what we do and say to the kids. And I could go on with more lists about dramatic differences between low and high expectation teachers. And so this notion of what you mean by impact and having high expectations, you can see is pretty powerful. Not too hard, not too easy, not too boring. That's what we want in terms of our expectations. Goldilocks, she got it right. What about the will, the dispositions? And there are many of these, and there's a whole debate about 21st century skills and soft skills and all these kinds of things. But when it comes down to it, when I do all the analysis, I look at things like growth mindset and grit. Their effect size is quite small. Positive, but quite small. Quite small in the right direction, and I think we need to get smarter about this. And as I talked to my good friend Carol Dweck about this, she's very, very aware that people have many times totally misinterpreted her work. She says things like growth mindset is the most fixed mindset of the lot. Her current work is very much based on trying to understand when is the right time to have a growth mindset and when is the right time when a fixed mindset's okay. I assure you that if I ask you to stand up now and walk through that wall in your room to have a cup of coffee, you'd all say, I'm not going to do that. I get a sore head. I don't care how much anyone tells you that you can't do it yet or you have to have a growth mindset. It's a mistimed place. And many of the programs that are out there on grit and growth mindset are generic programs. And kids go to them, they love them, parents love them, teachers love them. But when the kid's in strife, when they're in trouble, when they're in difficulty, when they're confused, when they've made mistakes, they still say things like, I can't do it. This is not for me. They don't have a growth mindset at the right moment. I think there's some very interesting work going out there at the moment where people are looking at how you can know the right moment. So be careful about generic skills, teaching these things in growth mindset classes and having we're a grit class. No. What do the students do when they're in those moments, when they're confused, when they don't know? That's when it really matters. And self-efficacy is the strongest effect. Do the students have a sense of confidence that they can attain the success criteria? Because if they don't have a sense of confidence they can attain it, they probably are not going to engage, they're not going to be involved. They're the withdrawing. They're the ones that are going to disrupt your classroom with other activities, so they don't want to be seen to fail. So this sense of confidence, which in many ways is kind of like grit, it's kind of like self-efficacy, it's like growth mindsets, but it's something that we have to need and can specifically be concerned about. I want all my students to have the confidence they can get there. It helps for me to tell them what getting there looks like. It helps them to show them what the destination looks like, so they're part of this journey. And influences that maximize the will. How do we teach kids the strategies of learning? I've been recently reviewing about 15,000 hours of class transcripts of classrooms. And when I go through those 15,000 hours, asking, for instance, when a teacher deliberately teaches a different learning strategy or listens to a student about what strategies they use, in those 15,000 hours, I didn't find a single occurrence. So from a student's point of view, they're expected to know how to learn. They're expected to know what to do when they don't know what to do. Well, I think this is something I want us to have an impact on. I want us to teach kids the strategies of learning. And yes, we've developed a model, which I'm not going to go into in great detail here with us today, looking at what the kids bring to the class in terms of the skill, will, and the thrill, and arguing that they're also the things that we want them to leave at the end. And we look at what are the strategies that are best when we first are exposed to the content. How then we consolidate it and put it in through that working memory to make it long-term memory. How then we deep acquire and deep consolidate, and how do we then transfer? And yes, the strategies work differently at different parts of that model. So it's not as simple as saying, these kids have got these learning strategies. It's going that next step and saying, they have these learning strategies which they know how to apply at the right time. Who said learning was easy? But I do think we know about strategies. So one of the things I want you to take away from today is, how do we have an impact about teaching kids the strategies of learning? And as you can see with some of these slides and the schools that we've been working with, they've come up with lots of different ways to talk about learning dispositions and working out different ways of doing things at the right time. This one from a school here not far from Melbourne, looking at the different aspects of what it means to have an impact in the school: self-motivated, reflective, resilient, creative, and curious. And this school, which looks at which strategies did they use, which helped, how do we go about monitoring our learning? And probably the most powerful one, can the student teach others? I go back to my granddaughter, four-year-old. She loves to teach me things. She loves me to show me how to do this next thing. She thinks herself as a teacher. I worry that by age 8, she'll think her job in classroom is to sit there and watch you work. The highest and most powerful exit ticket, are you now ready to teach someone? And this is why we talk about the biggest impact we want to have on our students, is we want them to teach them to be their own teachers. What about the thrill? What about the motivation? What's the reason that your students come to your classroom? Do they come to your classroom because they want to be with their friends? They have to. They want to study the work. They want mastery. They want enough to pass the next test. Is this on the next test? That's all they want to know. Well, the effect size from what we call the surface levels of motivation, of thrill, pass test, look good in front of their friends, you can see it's pretty low. In fact, tiny. You can see deep, wanting to understand. It's pretty powerful. But here's the problem with deep. You can't be deep all the time. And despite what we say at times in our classrooms, that we want kids to be deep, we want them to relate ideas, we want them to be problem solvers, the tasks we set them don't demand those activities. And kids aren't silly. They think what you value is what you ask them to do, what you assess them on, and their assignments and their work. And so the skill is knowing when to be deep and when to be surface. This is what we mean by self-regulation, metacognition. And again, it's a skill that I think we should be teaching. It's part of our impact. And sometimes it can be quite explicit. In fact, in my own teaching, for the last 30 years, I give students 2 questions about everything. And one question I say to them, this is about the content I want you to know. And the second question, and this is a deep, how I want you to relate it. I don't think they should have to guess what's inside my brain about what I want them to do. I don't want to be generic, because every time I'm generic, to be safe, what they do is just give me lots of stuff back. They give me back what I told them in their own words. And that's just not good enough. I want them to explore, to be curious, to do things, what they don't know, and to search for new ideas. And this notion of knowing when to do that is pretty powerful. So what I've tried to do today is to come back to this notion of impact. What do you mean by impact? And as I commented on right at the beginning, is that notion of impact shared with your students? And even better, is it shared with your colleagues in your school? Why should it be that every time a kid goes to a different teacher, they have a different concept of what impact means? It shouldn't be that random. And for some kids, it's no surprise. They give up on this place called school because they haven't worked out what it is we really value as opposed to what we tell them sometimes we value. So what do we mean by impact? And it's about what? It is about content. It is about deep relationships. It is about relating ideas. It is about transfer. And how many of the students in your classroom are experiencing this impact? Like, we all know that you go to every classroom in the world, there's always a few students we can pick out that are doing a stunning job, and they probably were doing a stunning job despite us. But how do we reach every one of those students and put every one of those students gains that at least year's growth for a year's input? And as I said before, I see this happening in so many classes and so many schools around the world right now. It can happen, it is happening. And we need to upscale that. And then the fourth question, what is that magnitude? How big is that impact? And I know we can get quite technical here now, and we do in our work get quite technical to work out ways of impact. And I just think it's a fascinating commentary that around the world that many of us have thousands, if not tens of thousands, measures of achievement, but very few measures of growth. And as you saw, I want both. I want the growth, because it's through growth you get to achievement. I want to understand what that magnitude of that impact is. And so here in this webinar today, I hope I've introduced you to the three big notions of the will, the skill, and the thrill. And all three are so valuable. How we need to have a lot more discussion about what we mean by impact, not only ourselves, but with our students and with our colleagues. And with that, I want to hand you back now to Amanda to make some final comments. Amanda.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. That was really great. I know I probably say this every time, but I always learn something new from these webinars, so thank you. And now that we've all learned how important it is to evaluate our impact, you may be wondering where to start. And that's why we wanted to introduce you to Visible Learning Plus. So Visible Learning Plus is the one and only sustainable school change model that's backed by 30 years of research and an international body of efficacy. This is a powerful process that combines professional learning with evaluation tools, all to accelerate student learning and increase school-wide achievement. Next slide, please. Corwin and our partners, Osiris and Basalt, located in Europe and the UK, are the only providers that currently offer the official Visible Learning Plus professional development model and evaluation tools. Next slide, please. But on that note, we're very excited to announce a new opportunity for schools that are outside of our current delivery regions. So now schools in any part of the world can join the Visible Learning movement by certifying a team of internal staff members to deliver Visible Learning Plus within your school or network. So through this opportunity, you'll receive exclusive access to the Visible Learning Plus workbooks, video exemplars, and activities, as well as the state-of-the-art efficacy and assessment tools and reports to measure your impact. Next slide. All schools that implement Visible Learning Plus are eligible to become certified Visible Learning schools. So if you're currently implementing Visible Learning Plus, this is a really great way to be recognized for your progress and achievement, as well as all of the effort that you're putting into this. So reach out to your local Visible Learning provider to see if you qualify for this prestigious award. Next slide. And if you want to brush up on some of the research behind the Visible Learning Plus model, we have a Visible Learning official books collection, so check that out on our website at corwin.com. We also have a number of new resources that are publishing this year on popular topics such as Mind Frames for Leaders and student collective efficacy. Next slide. All right, and again, thank you so much. For more information on any of these offerings we mentioned, such as Visible Learning Plus and the school network licensing model, please go to visiblelearningplus.com to learn more about the offerings or get involved in the Visible Learning community. And again, thank you all so much for your time, and thank you, Professor Hattie, for sharing your wisdom with us. I'll see you all next time.